Okay, so we are on. Uh, hey guys, it's a pleasure to have you here. We are with Jonathan from OJT Architects, and he is going to talk with us for 15 minutes about his story, about his career, and about a project that he developed over there in New Orleans. It's called Starter Home, and it's a great thing that we found last year, and he is here with us to talk and to tell us about all the journey, all the beginnings, and how he came up with the idea. So, hi, Jonathan. It's an honor for us to have you here. How the things are going over there in New Orleans?
No, things are wonderful. Thank you for asking, and I appreciate you all having me here for this, and an opportunity to talk to others about what we're up to in New Orleans and in the practice specifically. To go over things, generally, our office is fairly young. We started in 2011 as a sort of outgrowth of another practice that I was a member of that had relocated to New Orleans post-Katrina. So right after 2005 and the storm, and we found ourselves here in New Orleans for various reasons, and kind of established ourselves in the city. And really, we're sort of taken by the engagement of both our profession and everyone involved in the rebuilding of the city, and wanted to participate in that, and felt like at the time there was no better place to be than here. I mean, and that's globally, I think, as we were looking around, like where would one want to be, and New Orleans felt like the place for us. So as we found ourselves here in New Orleans and trying to establish ourselves in a practice, as I said, around 2011, I left the other office and started my own firm. And through that, actually through teaching and through practice, eventually teaching faded away and the practice picked up as we've established ourselves in the city. And what was important to us as an office as we began was really to take the things that we loved out of practice and the things that we loved out of academia, and somehow sort of combine those into a functioning and operational office, let's say. So a legitimate architectural practice in that respect. And by that, what I mean is that we enjoyed the research and the analysis and the investigation one can do in an academic environment, but also love making buildings and the process of both architecture and design, but also construction, and seeing things, get accomplished and come into the world as real animate objects. And so through that process, and again, as sort of a young office, we took a very entrepreneurial approach, and so we were aggressive in the way that we looked at work and we thought about work. We have a pool, and still have a pool of conventional clients, and so the way I'd like to describe the office, and again, this sort of began this way and it continues to evolve in similar terms, is that we're really sort of made up of, let's say, three compartments, if you will. One is a conventional practice where we have conventional clients, and we do architectural commissions, right? So it's a private sector primarily. We don't really do public work, and we don't really solicit for public work either. Not that we're opposed to it. It's just we've been able to manage with private clients so far, and that's for a range of work, anywhere from residential and housing to we've done museums to other institutions. Institutional, let's say, projects as well. And through that, again, it's sort of a rich, diversified client base, which is very important to us. Like, we want to work with people. So I want to keep that in the fore. Research is another big component of our office, and how research works or investigations work for us is that they come about at different levels. One, it could be a client has instigated something for us, and that we've decided to sort of continue that line of thought as a way to, one, engage in a topic that we're curious about and would like to know more about, and posit something about, let's say, and then, or in an effort to make a project better that we happen to be working on, we feel like it's a necessity. So these things are sort of running in parallel typically. And then, but the sort of third component, and that is literally, sort of, as I said before, kind of an outgrowth of academia and a desire to kind of dig in and really understand things in a way that you don't typically get to in an architectural project. But from that grew out actually another component of the practice, which is the development side of things, which is again sort of an outgrowth of a core interest in both working with people, but also in investigating things and seeing where they lead. And in our case, some of these research endeavors actually led to possibilities in development itself, or development became the tool for us as a way to sort of continue the evolution of that thought, right? So it was a kind of natural progression from digging into a topic and then recognizing, architecture's role in that and the role of the architect in particular in that, and then how we could continue that discussion and expression of possibilities through the actual creation of the thing, right? So which made us, get into being the developer in that case. So,
okay. And, sorry, you can.
No, I was going to say, in a lot of these things, as you might imagine, no one comes knocking on the door and asks for you to do it, right? So yeah. You've got to sort of take matters in your own hand. So that's what we've been able to do.
Cool. So you talk a lot about research and how you guys love this mix with university background and how to put that in the market. And talking about the starter home idea, it's a lot of research over there. I read the material that you have on the website, and you can see that it's a lot of research. How did you guys came up with the idea? How did you guys were in that direction to find this opportunity?
Yeah, well, it's actually, as with most things in life, it's a series of circumstances that align and sort of push you in a particular direction. And in our case, what I like to say is that it began with a conversation with someone that we were working with on another project, hence the private client. As I said, it's sort of important that we're engaging with people other than ourselves, right? So we become too insular if we're not careful. But it began with a conversation with a client of ours who was interested in the idea of developing housing for artists, or affordable housing for artists, and as a kind of origin point. And what we had kind of recognized in the city, and what we were seeing, throughout our country and in other countries as well, is the difficulty of housing in general, especially, and by difficulty I mean the sort of cost, the availability, like all of the sort of concerns one has and again, I'm going to use America as a context where home ownership is sort of it is one of the fundamentals of like life for us in some ways, which is hard to describe in some countries, but it's really it's sort of the bedrock of how we kind of live in some ways, but also as a foundation for wealth and opportunity also, right? So it's, again, as a milestone in how one evolves and grows and matures in their life, home ownership becomes sort of a component of that. And as was happening both with myself and other people, as we were looking around the city, we just noticed that a few things were happening, and again, that were indicative of other concerns around the country, is that there just was not a lot of product on the market. For instance, there just wasn't a lot of housing in your urban core areas, so that was starting to tighten up. Basically, we saw as a consequence, the cost of housing was beginning to balloon and frankly just unattainable for people. And the other thing, what we really wanted to push back on was the idea that in a speculative market that you couldn't have architecture in some ways. If you think about speculative development, in other words, a builder or a developer making something for a generic audience, it's always going to be generic in some ways, right? So you have to sort of, it's the least common denominator in some ways. And so our question is like, why can't you have design in that realm as well? And so there's a series of these questions sort of pop up that we began talking about. And then over the course of a few months, we realized like, well, this is great. Let's figure this out. What is going on? So You've got the kind of economic concerns around housing and first-time home buyers, what we refer to as starter homes generically, and then but also the dynamics around development in general for production housing, and the dynamics around development in the kind of historic urban cores, right? So these were all things that we just started going, wait a minute, there's something here, we need to grab onto it. So through that process, we recognize that, you know what, like, let's dig into this, let's figure out what the opportunities are, let's see where the possibilities are to actually make, you know, what would be sort of, let's say, middle income affordable housing. So not truly affordable, but the sort of middle bracket. And let's figure out, you know, what are the possibilities for land and how that happens to work, and, you know, what are the opportunities with design and offering people something that felt more like a custom home and less like something that they just pulled off of, you know, plans shelf or a book somewhere and reproduced. And then in addition to that, what we realize is that for this segment of development in general, is that there actually isn't a lot of pressure if you think about it. And the way I often describe it is that at the high end of the market, so high-end development, you're going to have plenty of people interested in that bracket because of the potential profits associated with it, right? So as long as the market's working, it pays for itself, so to speak. There's enough, the cost of what people are producing and what they're able to sell for is enticing enough to most developers that they'll certainly chase it down. So that, as we like to say, kind of takes care of itself. The lower end of the market, although in America or in the U.S. rather, it's not well funded. Nonetheless, there's a structure in place that addresses affordable housing through subsidizing units and in various subsidy models that, frankly, if you're not kind of geared up for that as a developer, it's hard to engage in. But nonetheless, like, people are working on that, right? And what we discovered is it's this middle band that nobody's really thinking about it because two things: one, it's not being subsidized, and then two, the profits generated from it, at least in our context, just aren't great enough to entice developers to engage in it, right? So this is where, if you read some of the material, we start talking about gaps in the market, right? So here is a zone where all of a sudden nobody's thinking about things. Yeah. So that's where we started digging in at that point.
Cool. Here in Brazil, we also have this home ownership dream. So it's very traditional. You only are a grown-up man when you buy a house. We are starting to change. I think the younger generations are starting to rethink this. But yeah, we understand totally this home ownership idea. As a big dream. Can we get back a little bit and talk about the fundamentals of the idea, because we started to talk about the opportunities, the gap in the market, but I think maybe the audience is not very is not understanding everything that we are talking about. How do you define the starter home in few lines for the guys to understand?
No, you're exactly right. So the starter home is a conventional or traditional term used in the housing industry to refer to a house that someone would buy, their first house they would buy. So, and that's typically defined as a relatively smaller home, not enormous, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom at the most. That, if modest, I guess is the best word to describe it, and on the lower end of the housing cost scale, right? So this would be, you know, a home that was, I don't want to use numbers because they're kind of meaningless in a global context, but but I would say entry price point is what I would refer to it as. So it's something that you imagine a person starting out in their life and in their career should be able to afford, right? And traditionally, these homes, what made them affordable is that they're associated with what we refer to as greenfield development. So basically, in the suburbs, you know, developing large tracts of land that are economical. So you get the house, you get the yard, and that's sort of where this development happens. So for us, the play on starter home was important because, one, we are looking at entry-level housing. That's important to us, but we're also repositioning it not as a greenfield or suburban development, but as actually an urban development and how that might work. And that does play into some of the change in ideology, let's say, around housing. And, you know, it's as we're both acknowledging, traditionally it was a you did this is what you did, and this was important. And I think as generations are starting to progress, the idea of ownership isn't, it's just, it has different meaning for people now. So, and certainly being sort of pushed out in the suburbs as your only opportunity was something we were pushing back against too. Like, people want to live in the city. How do we create those same kind of opportunities, but in an urban context? So does that help? Does that flesh out a little bit more when I say starter home, what that means?
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's a great explanation. So let's talk about the how difficult it was to sell this idea or this new your research, because when I saw over there you have like small odd lot types in the city, and maybe if you look to only one, you say, well, this is not a big opportunity. But when you look to the whole picture, you say, wow, we have like millions and millions of dollars that we are not looking for, not looking at. So how was the beginning? How do you guys sold the idea to others?
Yeah, well, it's actually, that was the fun part of all this, and frankly, this is where the kind of investigation and research part of it was most important, because we started out, you know, as we're discussing so far, about an idea of housing, but not what that meant in reality, right? So how do you ground it? How does it become a building and a piece of architecture? Well, in our context, you've got an architect, and then the person we were working with that kind of began the conversation, who was a consulting developer, basically an owner's rep for different projects. Like, neither one of us had deep pockets, so to speak. Like, we weren't, you know, we didn't have a big bank account that we could go buy whatever we wanted and sort of go with it. So two things were at work here. One is that we didn't have a lot of money to spend on an investment, so we had to keep that in mind. So resources were sort of thin. And then secondly, there was a lot of, we were interested in new housing and not renovating existing housing. So, and single family versus multifamily. So it was a very specific market, but there was actually a lot of competition for land, or what was assumed to be available land in the city. So our thinking is like, well, we've got to find opportunities people aren't looking for. Like, how do we find something that nobody sees, basically? And so that's where, as you look through the material, a lot of the effort was kind of digging through lots and properties in the city of New Orleans, and recognizing, like, wow, there are these little pieces of land everywhere that, you know, most people wouldn't think you could put anything on it, you know, for one, because they're either too small or awkward or just strange in general. And so we identified all of those, and it had, back to my original point, it had the added benefit of both being small, i.e. cheaper, so you're not buying as much land, so the land cost should be less. And then the second part of that is that developers didn't know most conventional developers don't understand or didn't know what to do with them, so they left us alone. We sort of had, you know, the opportunity to go after these things and try to acquire them without, you know, 10 other people in front of us, basically. So that was the real play, and it captivated people. I have to say, like, when it finally sort of came out and people saw it, it's like they got it. They're like, oh wow, this is an opportunity. I see how this works. I could spend some time sort of talking about how it didn't work out immediately. Like, you get a lot of pushback where people are like, you shouldn't put a house on this lot, you should park a car there, and that's it. So there's a lot of either just kind of animosity in general, just because they didn't like the idea of putting another house next to these houses so close. And although our city's very dense by American standards, they but then a genuine like, wow, how'd they do that kind of attitude. And so the first one, as we made our way through, we were able to purchase one lot after soliciting a lot of lots, frankly. And that's another longer story. It's probably not worth getting into, but purchasing land in general is difficult. So I have respect for developers who were able to acquire land and all those other things. It was, I have to say, this whole process was a way for me to understand our clients, our development clients, in ways that I hadn't, or thought that I did, but I hadn't really understood. But nonetheless, we were able to purchase the one lot. We went through a period where we were soliciting people as partners where they might be interested. Would you like to help us with this? And there was a lot of, they got it. People understood. I see what you're doing. This is fascinating. They probably didn't understand the extents of it, but at least as a single lot, as a single house, they got it. It was peculiar. We understand. But nobody really wanted to engage. They in a real way. They certainly want to talk about it, but nobody wanted to commit, if you will. And so eventually we just did it on our own. And at that point, as we were moving through the process, it got a lot of local press. Like a lot of people in town were like, wow, look at these people doing this. And unfortunately, it was under the banner of tiny houses or small houses, which is not what we were trying to do, but it was hot at the time, and it garnered some local attention. At that point, we got a lot of calls from people. They were like, hey, I have one of these lots, or I have one of these lots. Can I help? Can you help me do something with these? Which was great. Like, it was fascinating. I mean, we talked to 2 or 3 people a day probably that were just calling out of the blue. And they, and this is locally, and most of those fell away ultimately. And I would say it's like when a individual says, oh, I have to pay architectural fees in order to do this, or I have to do something in order to make this work, like the interest falls away at some point. But coincidentally, at the same time, the city was actually, the city of New Orleans began auctioning some of their vacant parcels in the city, and they had a number of these little lots as well. And so there was another round of people saying, oh, I bought this lot, I don't know what to do with it, will you please help me, right? And so one of the houses in the series that we worked on was actually a house that we sort of did a development process for a private client, basically. So which was an interesting, so if you think about how, at least I'll start locally, how people have responded to it, for the first time, I think professionally, and might be unique for most professionals, is that you had a client coming to you saying, I'm paying for your idea. Like, I like what you're doing and I want you to do it, and I'm going to provide whatever you need in order to make it happen. Versus, hey, I'm here, I want to do a office tower, this is my program, or whatever else. These are literally people coming in like, here, I'm investing in you and I'm investing in this idea, and let's kind of make it work, which still is bewildering to me in some ways. It's like, that's amazing. When I stop and think about it, it's really a sort of profound thing to happen. And again, I feel like it's likely unique for most architects, but maybe not. Maybe, clients do show up and tell you to do your thing, not just from a design perspective. And that's what makes this different, I think, right? It's like, certainly we're all talented designers, and we can all make beautiful things, right? Generally speaking. Yeah. And we're, I like to think we're competitive in that realm in some ways, but where we really have said, how do we distinguish what we do? It's like, well, there's thought that goes behind the idea of the thing and not just about what it looks like, right? And I'm rambling a little bit, so bear with me. But this is an important point I try to make, and now's kind of the time to make it, is that the effort in this is sort of multifold. We talk about development, we talk about starter home and engaging people. I also thought about it as advocacy for our profession, right? Like, all of a sudden, you had an architect in the role of making, real tangible decisions about what housing could look like in the city, implementing it as well. And instead of, having someone come to you to do it, and you were able to own it through its design and what it looked like, but fundamentally, the concept came from somewhere, right? If you know what I mean. And so this was a chance for, like, we were able to sort of back ourselves into a process that normally we don't engage with as a profession, which was important to me. It's like, look, we're smart, we can think about things, and we can contribute to the process of making cities in ways that go beyond just what it looks like and spatially what it is, but programmatically and conceptually what a place, what a city can be, right? So, and what housing can be and all those other things. So, so anyway, there was a lot of, back to the question, people were very interested. They grabbed onto it, and we've gotten a lot of, again, locally, just a lot of people that are interested. What also turned into is, like, people got it and they're like, okay, I can do that too. And so you get people that are sort of spinning off and, like, finding these little lots and doing their thing. And so there, as it turns out, going back to the statement I made originally, now there is a lot of competition for these little lots because they were able to say, they are buildable and we can do something with it.
Yeah. So I think that you always have two sides. You be the first one, right? You are the first, but also you have, like, a lot of guys that come after you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, what's next for this idea? Do you have any plans to continue that? I saw one of your studies about other cities as well. So how do you feel about the next step?
Yeah, it's that's actually what we're working on now, and what happened, and I described sort of a local interest in this. We had a little bit of exposure at a national level, and we've gotten people from cities anywhere from LA to Newark to Louisville to Toronto to Austin to Houston to several cities around the country where we've had independent or private developers come to us and say, hey, we're interested in doing your project, can we make it work? And so we've chased those down a little bit, so our next level interest is like, if this really works as an idea and it's really a thing, how it needs to work outside of New Orleans. It needs to, it's important to us that this isn't just a local issue, but it's topical for the nation at large, right? So and how does it work in other places and other cities? And so we've, I'd say over the last 1.5 to 2 years now, we've been working in other cities just to try to see how we might be able to deploy our idea or our concept. And the thing that we have to work with people on originally, and we've had interest from just individuals that like, look, I want to fund this and make it happen, or developers who are, I think this is really smart, I want to make it work here. But the thing that we have to begin with is that the land play is different in every city, right? And so the dynamics around housing is different in every city. When you really get down to it, like the overall pressures are the same, but the specifics around how housing works and what's right, because Newark, maybe Newark, I don't know, this is hard. Like Newark and LA do have a single family contingent, but there are other places, like it certainly wouldn't work in Manhattan, right? Like this is not Manhattan. Or Sao Paulo for that matter, right? So at least not in the city itself. And so they, so what we end up doing is like there's an initial period where we have to describe to people, and work with them to kind of figure out what land opportunities and zoning opportunities and development opportunities exist in the city, and then tailor the program around that. So there's a kind of a whole nother research project that you go through just to go, here's where we are. And the one that we spent the most time on and are ready to start actually implementing housing, and building housing rather, is in Louisville, Kentucky. And that was, and it's not up on the site yet, and I'll get it up before the end of February, but before this airs. But that information and that sort of program that we developed went through a similar process where we just studied what we thought were possibilities in the city, how things might work, and then came up with a whole nother addressing the same issues, but a different strategy for doing it. So that's been our, as in terms of expanding, that's been our focus. We've got a couple other houses here in town that we're working on. And another one that I'll try to get some information up about is that, and I should say with each of these, whether they're in New Orleans or Louisville or LA or wherever, it's, what can we do different every time? And it's not about replicating the same thing over and over again, right? So
not like a formula where you can just repeat that. You have the research. Cool. I hope that we can talk again like next year, and maybe you have more and more projects running around.
Me too.
Let me talk about, let me ask you a little bit about innovation, because here in Brazil, architects, they love to create a project, but they don't love to sell, and they are not very fond of innovate in the model like you did, searching for new opportunities. They are very traditional in the idea of a firm or a practice, an architectural practice. So how can architects innovate in this market that is very traditional? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, it's going back to some of the original points. I think in some ways, at least for us, it was like showing people you can do it, right? And in our case, taking on something that wasn't enormous. It was, you know, all intents and purposes, that first house, if it didn't sell, it wouldn't bankrupt any of us. It's fine. I might be living in it right now, but it wouldn't.
Yeah.
But at least it wouldn't bankrupt us. So I think it was a fairly safe bet in a way, but it may take, you know, taking some risk. And I think when you look at development and you look at market, what we undervalue as a profession, because I don't think we feel it in the same ways, is the idea of risk, like true financial risk when it comes to development, right? And
Yeah.
And when you're willing to sort of accept that, I don't encourage it, frankly. Like, it's tough and it's scary, and it doesn't always end well, right? So you have to keep all that in mind. But I think those are the opportunities or ways that one could sort of branch out in the market. At least that's what we saw. I mean, other than that, you know, the tools at our disposal are you know, visioning for people, right? Like, how do we explain to people things can be done differently? And if it's something that someone can grab onto, and whether it's you or whether it's a partner that, you know, you've been able to work with and garner some trust, whether it's a client, then, I mean, those are, I think you always have to sort of look for an angle or a position to kind of push an idea forward and find the right people to collaborate to do it with, right? So, and that's really vague, I apologize, but that's the way we tend to operate in practice, is we think as entrepreneurs in a way. I mean, that sounds really generic, or cliche rather, but I mean, we're always, okay, what can we make out of this? Like, what is the other thing we might be able to do in addition to what's happening? Or in the case of the housing, it's like, what are we seeing out there? I mean, we're architects are wonderful at seeing the world in ways that not everyone sees it, right? So we have a gift for that, both spatially but conceptually, and seeing those opportunities and trying to sort of put them forward, or look for ways to, you know, find projects through what we're seeing in the world. And so I think, you know, in some way, it's a couple of things. One is just creating a disposition as a practice that you're looking for those and or searching them out and proposing them, I think, is important. But then two, finding collaborators and partners that want to invest in new opportunities and then doing it. And then otherwise, the last thing is just doing it on your own and finding out how, you know, that might work. So I think historically, at least from academia, if I look at it, and I've had a chance 25 years on now to reflect a lot on the things that sort of shaped me through education and kind of early life experiences as I was moving into this profession. And I was a participant in a program at Auburn University called the Rural Studio, and which had a very, you may be familiar with it, or your audience may be familiar with it, but is basically a kind of satellite program from the architecture school that lived in a rural area and facilitated the design and building of housing for you know, people that were economically poor people, basically the rural poor, if you will. And so it had a profound impact on me as an individual, and both with the desire to sort of help and like, what can we do as practitioners to engage the world in meaningful ways and help and assist, and what can we do to make the world better, I guess, in more general terms. But the thing that I look back a lot on now, however, is like how the person who created the program, Samuel Mockbee, saw an opportunity and facilitated it. He acted upon it. He didn't wait for somebody to tell him that you can do this. Like, he engaged it and he figured out a way to make it happen. And so that has been an inspiration to me, that just to say that, you know, you can make things happen if you put the effort forward in order to do it. And so that's where, you know, with the starter stuff, it's like, well, here we are, like, let's just make it happen. We'll figure it out. We're smart people. We'll figure it out. So, like, go for it.
Cool. Yeah, I think this is the main idea of our talk and all the talks that we are having, is to encourage the architects to take risk, to take action, to use this ability to see the world in a different shape, and how to create this new reality. So yeah, I think I agree totally with you. To ask you two more questions. One is about Brazil. Have you ever been to Brazil? Do you know anything about our country, our architecture? How do you guys over there connect with our work over here?
Well, thank you for asking. I was hoping we would do this interview in Sao Paulo, but that's I'll have to, unfortunately. No, it's I've actually been to Sao Paulo a few years ago. Let's see, 2008, 2009. I was in your country, and it was, and we were through graduate school actually doing a lot of work in research and looking at informal settlements around the city in particular. And so so there was some studio work associated with that, and then we spent some time in the city and sort of visiting these places and proposing through the school that I was at, kind of studio-based work. And so I was there for basically an academic trip. So yeah, so I'm most certainly familiar with your country. I have incredible respect for everything you all are doing. It's a beautiful place. Would love to get back soon, actually. So
maybe our next talk could be physically speaking in São Paulo or anywhere in Brazil. Yeah, so cool. My last question is about the future. What do you expect, not for your business only, but for the architecture market for 2018, 2019? What do you feel about the future?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting question, and it's hard not to think about it in terms of your own practice and think through what you see as possibilities as you're moving forward, and would suspect that sort of encompasses the profession a little bit larger terms. But I still think housing is an issue that we're going to continue to talk about, right? It's the problems that we're having haven't been solved in any real meaningful way. They continue to get more complex. We're seeing growth in ways that, at least in our country, is just astounds me in some ways. But the flip side of that is recognizing that we're, at least and again, I'm using the U.S. context here since that's where I practice primarily. It's you see a lot of concentration and aggregation into metropolitan nodes now, which has happened, historically, and it's continued to happen. And what we've begun to turn our interest to are looking at smaller towns and rural areas and what happens to these places, right? And they, it's easy to work in cities to some extent, but how does architecture, how does urbanism impact cities that have stabilized, if not declining, and smaller places around the country, because they still make up a good deal of the fabric of our country, right? And so we're now looking at what are the possibilities. How do we as architects involve ourselves in those places, and it becomes a real interest in that case. And then politically, which I don't need to go into, that's a whole nother thing. We'll see. I would love for infrastructure to be a real thing instead of just something that people, sort of bad about and talk about. But, I have for years seen, and a lot, like a lot of others, seen a real opportunity for architects and urban designers to engage in infrastructure and redevelopment of infrastructure in our country, and I hope that there's funding and that really actually happens throughout the year. That would be a positive. That'd be a positive thing, I think. So those are the sectors that seem interesting to me. Again, like housing, something's got to happen there. What happens outside of our cities, in particular, to smaller towns, and looking at growth in those areas and non-growth in those areas, and then looking at infrastructure for larger terms, what possibilities are there, and maybe that happens this year, maybe it doesn't, but I think those are all things. So in the spirit of what's happening in our country, it's it remaining to be entrepreneurial about your work, right? Just thinking about opportunities and looking for opportunities and making those things happen.
It was an honor. Thank you again, and I hope to talk to you soon in São Paulo, in New Orleans, or even online.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. No, that'd be great. That'd be great. So please stay in touch. And this was fantastic. Thank you for the invitation. Okay.
Okay, Jonathan. Thank you. See you around. And keep going. I think the idea and the spirit are great. So we are cheering for you guys.
Thank you. Thank you. It means a lot. Thank you.
See you around.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.